Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. Before we start our talks, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and thank you very much, Stephen, for giving us weekly talks on such amazing topics. And thank you guys for joining us. Please feel free to give your feedbacks, to ask questions, and to interact with Stephen. We would love to see you all. Okay, Stephen, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, I too would like to thank the American Consulate in Almaty. I'd like to thank Aaliyah for moderating these talks, Tracy, Elmira, and Consul General Eric Meyer for giving me this opportunity to bring my philosophical perspectives to you, to our audience. So I really appreciate your joining us and your kind of bearing with what are often difficult issues that I try to clarify, and I hope to provide a variety of perspectives so that even if one particular approach might seem unfamiliar or strange or difficult, there are other avenues that we discuss that allow understanding of not the normal character that one will encounter in most venues, in contemporary society. So thank you again. Tonight's talk is inspired primarily by Women's History Month. I decided that I would, it has three components. I don't know exactly how. Again, I don't script these in advance, so it's not clear exactly how many of these topics I'll ultimately have time to address. But in principle, this talk is divided into three parts. First, I've selected some historical figures, women who have had an especially profound effect upon me or my work, women who have been particularly inspiring or insightful, and have been a constant source of guidance and again, inspiration. Then I want to talk a little bit about a particular instance involving Mileva Maric, the first wife of Albert Einstein, and some of the implications of their association. And finally, I'll conclude with a reading from one of my poetic works, again, not because the ideas are necessarily that easily understood when they're presented in poetic form. Again, philosophy is concentrated to begin with. Poetry is concentrated. Philosophical poetry is one of the most concentrated forms of writing possible. But such writings communicate not just through the actual ideas that they're expressing, but also through the sound, the music of the language. So I want to give you that perspective as well. Okay. When I began sort of selecting this list, and the women that I want to discuss, there are 8 women. I'm going to be discussing in chronological order. I'm not going to be going into a lot of their biography. I'm more interested in specific things that they might have written or said or done that were especially inspiring, especially profound, for my experience and my work. When I first began formulating the list, what popped into my mind as a kind of guiding principle is something not by a woman actually, but by the American philosopher Emerson, whom I've mentioned in the past. Emerson, an early 19th century American philosopher, who wrote in somewhat aphoristic, concentrated, terms as as is my preference, for expressing philosophy. Emerson at one point wrote, "Great nations, great spirits have not been boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life." Now, that's not meant to be depressing. It's meant to just establish that philosophy is interested in deep answers, profound answers to profound issues and circumstances that human beings confront. The women that I want to discuss share that spirit of a seriousness of response, and an awareness at various levels, of just those types of issues. There's an aphorism that I wrote that relates to Emerson's comment as well. It goes, "Philosophy is singular, to answer the horror now and to the beginning and end of time with one question. Is our logic stronger than our pain?" That's what the world's great religions address. It's what philosophy aspires to formulate responses to. And again, it's what the people I most admire historically, men or women, have been aware of and have been addressing in one way or another, in their lives and their efforts. Okay, so that presents a little bit of the framework for what I want to discuss. Actually, one more comment about it. You might have the sense that I'm not so interested in categories, right, or subcategories. I'm interested in not, the greatest American philosophers, the greatest contemporary philosophers, the greatest women philosophers. I'm interested in the greatest philosophers. And that applies to every category. The women that I'm going to be discussing tonight are as great, in my estimation, and have had as profound an influence upon me as any men. And I've made lots of reference over the months to men that have had profound influence upon my writing. Philosophers like Wittgenstein or Kierkegaard. Well, these women I hold in just as high regard. Okay. First woman that I want to say a few things about is the ancient Greek poet Sappho from the island of Lesbos. She was a lyric poet. Much of what has survived of her work survives in fragments. But for me, that's never been an impediment to appreciation or value. I mean, I'm writing in concentrated aphorisms. A lot of historical work that's had an influence upon me has only survived in fragmentary form. There's the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, the philosophers who lived before the time of Socrates, often come down to us only in short statements. A philosopher like Heraclitus is an example of that. Well, there is a narrative poem that I wrote some years ago, about 10 years ago now, called The Books of Joshua. And in that poem, it's an autobiographical poem in which the main character, Joshua, is basically my alter ego. So it's a fictionalized account of my sort of personal development, intellectual, philosophical development. And Joshua is the central figure in this work. There are not very many other people mentioned. There are people that play a significant role, but mostly they appear not by name. But Sappho appears by name. And there's a fragment of her poetry that I refer to, and I'll give you the quotation. It goes, "A song can clear the air, webbed and in need of repair, as Sappho, that the dead could have such hair." That's a line. Sappho's actual line is, "Who would have thought that the dead could have such hair?" And that's always stood for me as an embodiment, a distillation of the essence of the issue of mortality, the phenomenon of mortality. So Sappho has always been in the back of my mind because issues of mortality, issues of human suffering, but as in the case of Buddhism, disease, old age, and death have always been principal motivators to my thought. So Sappho has served as the embodiment of that issue, that concern, and the need to address just that circumstance. So again, I recommend Sappho. We don't have a lot of her work, but we have some, and I think you'll see that in Sappho we have a lyric poet of the highest order, the highest achievement, the highest sensibility. Next, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a 4th century Christian woman I've mentioned before as well, who was tortured to death at the age of 19 for her learning. She was tortured to death on the wheel. It's now called St. Catherine's Wheel. If you look up paintings of St. Catherine, and there are many, because she's considered one of the central figures in the Christian tradition, whether it's the Eastern Orthodox Church or Western Christianity, she plays an important role. She's also the patron saint of philosophers. It's kind of interesting that philosophy up until kind of recent times has been dominated by male figures, right? Most of the great historical philosophers that we tend to study, even that I refer to, have been men. But the patron saint of philosophy is a woman, St. Catherine. Well, in Joshua, I wrote an appreciation of St. Catherine, and I'll recite it. It's actually also, it was written in relation to Joshua's birthday, which is November 25th, which happens to be the feast day of St. Catherine, patron saint of philosophers. So this is a poetic appreciation of that. And in it, there's a reference to Joan. It's Joan of Arc. That's another woman I want to discuss. Joan of Arc heard voices, supposedly, according to her accounts, of saints. The 2 saints whose voices she heard that guided her career were St. Catherine and St. Margaret. So St. Catherine and Joan of Arc, 2 figures who have played, again, a significant role, in my intellectual development, are linked. Well, the lines from Joshua about St. Catherine go like this. Now we go further back to fill a conspicuous gap. Age is hearsay, says the sage. When we think we came to be is elemental mythology. One day, Joshua asked a friend, does philosophy have a patron saint to help secure its end? On November 25th of a misplaced year, she called from Huntsville to reveal St. Catherine as the keeper of the seal, the learned Catherine of the elevated wheel, whose voice led Joan to her choice and her appeal. And so was Joshua born, on the feast day of a tortured form, the feast day of philosophy, in the shadow of a dragon tree. So that's my appreciation of Saint Catherine in the books of Joshua. Joan of Arc is an extraordinary figure. We don't know an awful lot about Saint Catherine. We don't know a lot about Sappho. We know much more about Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc lived during the 15th century. She played a pivotal role in the 100 Years' War involving England and France. She was instrumental in helping to achieve the ultimate French victory. But she was betrayed and was handed over to the English and was burned at the stake for heresy, for blaspheming the tradition by claiming to have a direct sort of communication with saints who were guiding her. The account of her interrogation, by the English exists. You can read it. It's extraordinary. I mean, Joan of Arc is a figure of commanding intelligence, as we can sort of sense, from what has survived. Some things that stand out. Go forward bravely, fearing nothing. Trust God, all will be well. That's an extraordinary utterance. That's the language of a leader. That's the language of a commander. That's the language of somebody who's able to distill their message into a few simple words that have the power to comfort and inspire. It's really extraordinary. One finds it, throughout what has survived of her comments, of her statements. She said, now she was a military leader, that's what she's renowned for. She said at one point, the battle is first won or lost in the mind. Now that's something that one might read in Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher of war. That's something that Napoleon might say. Napoleon being very cerebral, very intellectual. That's not so much, what one would expect from a 17 or an 18 or a 19-year-old. So again, a commanding intelligence. She also said a couple of extraordinary things at the very end of her life. She wrote, I die for speaking the language of the angels. That's not just a distilled expression, that's a poetic utterance of the highest possible form. One doesn't find in Shakespeare anything superior to that. I die for speaking the language of the angels. It's really, again, an extraordinary communication. And apparently, her final words, when she was on the scaffold, on the stake, she was burned to death, were, hold the cross high so that I may see it through the flames. So Joan of Arc is not just an extraordinary intelligence, but a spirit of extraordinary courage, who merits, being, one of the most famous women in history. And if she's an example for me, if a woman needs inspiration, for what is possible, Joan of Arc provides it, not just for women, but for men. I mean, there's no one whose achievement at that age exceeds hers, and no one who manifests, greater courage and greater insight, and in a way, wisdom, about her circumstances, her calling, her endeavor. And actually, in Joshua, there are a couple of lines I wrote that link St. Catherine and Joan, and they go like this. And Catherine sends her legions forth to embolden Joan on her journey north towards a trembling star. And her only trace is the wind on your face, blowing from afar. So there's Joan of Arc. Around the same time, actually, as Joan of Arc, there was a German mystic, Meister Eckhart, a Christian mystic who wrote about the experience of mystical union with God. There's a series of sermons, a series of parables that he wrote, that one can read online. The one that was most affecting to me was one that's entitled Meister Eckhart's Daughter. Now, we don't know the circumstances surrounding it, but it's entirely possible that it's based upon, an actual encounter that Meister Eckhart had with a young woman, maybe a teenager. It's not quite clear. Meister Eckhart lived in a monastery, but his fame was considerable, in his time. One day, someone arrives at the monastery, this woman, and the doorman answers and asks, who it is. And the young woman, doesn't know how to characterize herself. She doesn't know how to introduce herself. She says, I'm not a girl, I'm not a woman, I'm not a wife, I'm not a maid, no category that might be appropriate to describe, a human being realistically applies to me, not that I feel comfortable in embracing. Well, we've discussed a lot about the nature of epistemic space, an aconceptual space. That's also the nature of mystical union with God, where all things become one thing, all distinctions vanish, all concepts vanish. We can't categorize within such an experience, within such a space. So it's part of what is meant by the silence of God. Language sort of ceases, to have applicability at either the limit of divergence in an epistemic space where all things are rigorously distinct, and so they can't be grouped or clustered together, or all things become one thing, right? Where again, distinctions vanish. So the doorman says, wait a minute, let me go and get Meister Eckhart. So he goes inside and says to Meister Eckhart, you've got to come to the door. There's the most extraordinary young woman. So Meister Eckhart goes forward, and the exchange is repeated. He goes up, the woman is still there. Meister Eckhart asks her, who is this? Who are you? And again, she repeats, I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not something else, no categories apply. I am just a something among somethings, and so I go. That's as good a characterization of the experience of being within epistemic space, within that rigorous space that one could put forth. That's a characterization that I've used in a number of different contexts and is always in the back of my mind. When Meister Eckhart heard that, he was astonished. And he later told the members of the monastery that he had just met the purest person he had ever encountered. So Meister Eckhart's daughter has played, that comes to us again through this account, has played an important role in my thinking, in my work. In more recent times, Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was a 19th century American poet that I've referred to on a number of occasions. For me, she represents the highest level of poetic achievement in any language. When I read her work, when I encounter her, she often seems to me to be as valuable a writer, as valuable a creative spirit as has lived. The introduction, now she wrote in the course of her lifetime about 1,800 poems. She was not known, right, until after her death, when her sister began making her works available to the public. Emily Dickinson was interested in fame, in being recognized, but it didn't happen. I think I told in a previous talk, I mentioned how she had reached out to a prominent literary critic of the time, hoping that he might embrace her work and help her be published, find a wider audience. And he wrote back, well, based on what he wrote back to her, it was clear that he wasn't even sure that what she was writing was poetry, let alone a candidate for greatest poetry ever written. So, Emily Dickinson's writing has been a huge influence. My first poem, actually, if you've read any Emily Dickinson, you might recognize. My very first poem was a tribute to her. Went, death is not vacuity. It has its forms, I know. Shadow of pearl, light of amber, over the rim of gall. That was where I began, but I was so sort of drawn to her work, her spirit, her style, her concentration, that was for me a place to start, the natural place to start. Let me recite one of her poems. While we were fearing it, it came, but came with less of fear, because the fearing it so long had made it almost fair. There is a fitting, a dismay, a fitting, a despair. 'Tis harder knowing it is due than knowing it is here. The trying on the utmost, the mourning it is new, is terribler than wearing it a whole existence through. Now, in the introduction to this complete, collection of her poems that I read many years ago now, there's a characterization of her that represents for me the best characterization I've ever read of her work and distills what it is that draws me to her so strongly, so deeply, so compellingly. The person writing the introduction wrote that she addressed the plight of a consciousness trapped in time. Yeah, that's a fundamental circumstance to address, and she addresses it as profoundly as anyone ever has. So, Emily Dickinson continues to be a major source of inspiration. She also is another person who is mentioned by name in the books of Joshua. I think probably more women appear, historically, significant, women than men by name in that work. Anne Frank, obviously 20th century, right? Victim of the Holocaust, died at 15. Another extraordinary intelligence and a courageous soul, a courageous spirit. One of the people I most admire, not a woman, but a writer that I admire, John Berryman, a 20th century American poet and literary critic. I actually happen to be more taken by his literary criticism than his poetry. But as a literary critic and as a stylist, a prose writer, writing criticism, he is for me at the highest possible level. I recommend his work, The Freedom of the Poet. It's a collection of essays, that he wrote in the course of his life on a whole variety of subjects, but mostly literary subjects. There's an essay in there that he wrote on Anne Frank. I think the title is The Development of Anne Frank. And it was written shortly after Anne Frank's diary was published. Now, the diary was published and became fairly quickly an international sensation that Berryman was one of the first to address, certainly to address in kind of what we might call high literary circles, from a serious academic viewpoint. He thought a lot of, the convergent elements that were responsible for the celebrity of the work were secondary. Even the fact that it was produced during the Holocaust, the fact that it was produced by a young girl. These were ultimately, in his estimation, coming to terms with her writing, the diary, was almost beside the point. For him, what was extraordinary, and he addressed this actually in the beginning of the essay, he said, when he was reading the diary, what struck him first and most strongly was a sane person in the middle of the 20th century. He compared her work, compared this diary that she wrote again from, I guess, the ages of 13 to 15, to the work of St. Augustine, St. Augustine's Confessions. He noted that comparison might seem almost grotesque, to compare the work of a young girl, the sole surviving work of a young girl, to the work of one of the architects of Western civilization, St. Augustine, a man whose intelligence Wittgenstein, esteemed as being of the highest order. But what Berryman found so extraordinary in what Anne Frank had achieved, in her short life and in this one work, was a representation of the process, and a first-hand representation of the process of the transformation of a child into an adult, of a child into a person. And he said, it's the most remarkable such account that he knew of in any literature at any time. And he said, obviously, the circumstances, of her life, the concentrated circumstances, the pressure, of those circumstances helped facilitate this development more rapidly than it might have been accomplished under other more relaxed circumstances. But it took an extraordinary intelligence to be able to mine the experience. And when you read from the diary, what you're struck by is a penetrating intelligence. Someone who it's hard to imagine. I mean, there's a lot there that does suggest, that we're dealing with, a young woman doing this writing, but there's also observations that suggest an intelligence and an order of processing of experience that is rare for anyone at any age. One of the things that has most struck me about that work is something that occurs at its very end. How Anne Frank was interested in the process of becoming, like a transformational process. She was aware that that's what she was, was chronicling. But she noted how much she wanted to be able to continue, her personal development, continue her growth, which she felt would have been possible had there been no other people in the world. This is a theme, right, that I stress when doing philosophy, that we're focused on the individual and we're focused upon the challenges of each of us in our circumstances, that ultimately it's presumptuous, it's arrogant to think that we can save others. Our responsibility is fundamentally to save ourselves. If we can do that, then maybe what we have to say or what we might have learned in the process will have some value for others. But it's like that admonition, physician, heal thyself. First heal thyself. If you can heal thyself, yourself, then maybe you have something to offer. But if you can't, then what reason do we have to think that what you're saying, your insights, are really of fundamental value if they don't even work in your case? Periodically, people say to me, well, how do you know your results will apply to others, will have any value for others? Maybe it's just true for you, your circumstances. Well, I explain, that is my responsibility, that my thoughts, honestly, are valid and have power for my circumstances, that they have decisive power for my circumstances, dealing with issues of loss or illness or pain or whatever the moment of death that I was experiencing in the middle of the Northridge earthquake. If they have power for me in the circumstances that I'm confronted with, and they have, then there's the possibility that they will have power for someone else. That's all I can attest to. And that's ultimately what our fundamental responsibility is. It's something that Gandhi also sort of stressed. At one point he wrote, my devotion to my people is the discipline I impose upon myself to liberate my soul. It's a matter of liberating his soul. That's what he can address. That's what he can attend to. That's his responsibility. And if he can accomplish that, then again, there's the possibility of his being an inspiration and a guide to others. The person who embodies that same viewpoint, somewhat surprisingly, I find, when people hear about this, is Mother Teresa, another 20th century figure. Mother Teresa is known legendarily, for her devotion to others, to the poor, to some of the most people living some of the most desperate circumstances, that any human beings have encountered. Well, Mother Teresa said at one point, "It was always and only between me and God." Again, she's seen for her efforts at helping others, helping people that others recoil from, helping people that others do not want to help, are afraid to help, don't have the time or the motivation. She was there for whoever was suffering, no matter what their circumstances. But the focus, fundamentally, ultimately, was her relationship to God. That, again, it's like the statement of Gandhi, that her service to others is an exemplification, an embodiment of her communication, her connection with God, which she saw as her fundamental sort of purpose. It was always and only between me and God. Again, that's what philosophy understands, right? Because that notion of addressing the circumstances that you are confronted with, finding a means of healing yourself, saving yourself, is the first order of business. First, oneself. Then one can address others, the generality. And finally, I want to recognize my mother, who is not historically known, obviously, but who was a consistent source of a distilled wisdom. And one can sort of summarize like her message in very few words, very few directives. And she would emphasize this over and over again. It was always please and thank you, and how would you feel if someone treated you this way? And then, in my case, no pointing, one thing at a time. And when you take something, put it back when you're finished the way you found it. So there's, again, a lot of wisdom in those simple directives, and that continues to be like a presence and a guide. And so there's wisdom and there's inspiration everywhere. And if one just is attuned or attentive, right? But those women that I've just gone to are, again, as high in my admiration, in my regard, have exerted as profound an influence upon me, my work, my outlook, as any human beings, any men that I've read or encountered or studied. And again, I regard them not in any given category, but as the highest of whatever they were engaged in. So that's my inspirational list. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the circumstance of the Leyva marriage. Probably many of you have not heard that name. Again, we're not, most of us, aware of it unless, we've studied, encountered specific biographies, specific histories. Turns out that Leyva marriage was Albert Einstein's first wife. What was interesting is that she was herself a mathematician and a physicist. Einstein had met her at a relatively young age. They went to the same, I think, institutes together. She performed on various physics examinations at a level comparable to the level of Einstein himself. She took advanced mathematics courses. Einstein commented at one point when somebody was complaining to him about their difficulty with mathematics. Einstein said, however great your difficulty is with the subject, mine is even greater. So Einstein it was often a challenge, for Einstein when he was having to use more advanced mathematical devices, tensor calculus, in developing the general theory of relativity. He needed to go to an Italian mathematician, for help with that. We don't know the exact nature of the collaboration between Einstein and Leyva. Some writers have claimed that Einstein got the majority or a substantial number of his fundamental ideas from her or in conversation with her. Others say there was no influence. We don't know. Now, at some point, there might be more kind of evidence, more papers, that come to light, but at this point, it's probably unlikely. So it's going to remain a matter of speculation, like how much of Einstein's work was motivated, stimulated, inspired, in some way, by Leyva through, ideas that she might suggest, perspective that she might bring that was different than his. We don't know for sure. One, though, and when we don't know something for sure, that means that whatever we say about it is in the realm of the heuristic, right? If we know something incontrovertibly, then it's epistemic. But if we don't know, we don't have direct experience, we don't have documentary evidence, whatever might satisfy us, well, then it's a matter of speculation. And the value of that kind of speculation is it can reveal us to ourselves. I use the example often of that classic question. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to observe it, does it make a sound? Well, we've set up a situation in that instance where there is no observer. So there's no direct experience of the falling tree. When there's no direct experience, again, the discussion, the situation belongs in the heuristic realm. We cannot know for sure, but what we say becomes diagnostic, can reveal to ourselves, for example, what we consider a fact to be, how we imagine that the world proceeds when we're not observing it or in our absence. Now, it's not something that we can know definitively, right? Because the situation is set up so that there is no such direct knowledge possible. But again, what we say is revealing of the way that we interpret the world, or the way that we fill in gaps, the way that we connect dots. When we can basically, we're getting a reflection of our mind by exploring such situations. Same thing applies here with Mileva. We're not going to know for sure, but the first and most important thing to realize is whether or not we consider it possible that she was the source, that she was responsible for Einstein's ideas. We don't know, but it's entirely possible that through, again, comments or again, a more considered and lengthy collaboration, she provided key ideas or the key ideas. So if you think it's not possible because, why? She's a woman? Well, what does that reveal about yourself, right? Your attitudes about your human capabilities. So from my perspective, yes, it's entirely possible. Another thing to notice about the situation, and this is one of the reasons why I'm bringing it up too, is Einstein is as celebrated a figure as human history offers. Right? He was Time magazine's person of the century for the 20th century. Time magazine noted that the 20th century was the century of science, and Einstein was its prophet, certainly its most commanding figure. Well, if it were to, now, you know that I've often referred to the aphorisms about time: the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, and has power to alter the past, reverse the past, if the future takes a sufficiently different direction from what it has and from what we anticipate. Okay? And the example I often give is, if one day we awaken to a totally different reality that persists, then this was dream. Future decides. Reality is a term of comparison. Well, the same thing applies and is illustrated in this situation with Einstein and his wife, Mileva. If it should turn out that we find evidence, let's say, writings, something that convinces us that no, the central ideas, the most important ideas came from Mileva, well, as great and as entrenched a figure as Albert Einstein is in culture will not remain, with that degree of entrenchment. I mean, at that point, Einstein could be diminished to the point where Mileva is elevated, to a central position in the history of thought. It's possible. Again, that's how the future can decide, can alter the past. It's a possibility. But again, we may never know. But I think the most important thing about the Einstein-Mileva relationship is that it is possible that a woman could have that degree of insight, to generate the kind of results that revolutionize physics. It is possible. Okay. Now, another issue that this gives rise to goes in a slightly different direction. And it's not something that I want to dwell on, but something that I want to bring up in this context. And that is Einstein, apparently, was a misogynist, didn't have the highest regard for women's intellectual abilities. Now, I had a girlfriend once whose mother was a musician, a pianist, and she actually played piano and helped instruct Einstein in his violin playing. The two of them would play duets together. She would be on the piano, Einstein would be at his violin. So from those encounters, I know a little bit about Einstein. I have a slight, window, from that personal experience of mine with my girlfriend's mother. Well, a couple of things that she noted is that, she would correct Einstein in his violin playing. He would make mistakes. He would play the wrong note or something, and she would correct him. Except Einstein was never quite able to incorporate the corrections. No matter how many times she would correct him, he would continue to make the same mistake. She also noted that, if he was eating, like food might fall on his shirt and he wouldn't do anything about it. It would just dribble down. She said that he actually conducted himself, at least around her, as if he was not fully mentally competent. But she also sensed that, yes, that he did have this attitude, kind of, which she discerned as kind of misogyny. Okay? So it wouldn't be entirely impossible for him to have downplayed the contributions of Mileva. We don't know that, right? But so the point is that Einstein's behavior, like towards women in general, was not always exemplary. Certainly, comments that he made apparently were not always fully defensible. It's something that we find today in what's called cancel culture. The idea that no matter how distinguished or the nature of one's contributions, if one says things that are offensive, right, racist, misogynistic, abusive, in significant ways, that can lead to the loss of the job, the loss of, clearly public standing, and maybe sort of almost a kind of cultural banishment. Now, I think you know that I tend to, again, focus on the individual and the dignity of the individual and the irreplaceability of individuals. So I am not in principle in favor of canceling people. I think it's important to take a more kind of compassionate sort of view of transgressions. But it leads to something that I did want to address more philosophically, more broadly. And that is, in the life of individuals, in our experience of the world, there's good, there's bad. There, in the case of an Einstein, there's an extraordinary scientific achievement, but there might be inappropriate or insensitive, attitudes, maybe even behaviors, towards women, possibly, for example. There are lots of examples, of that. So the question is, how do we deal with this issue, the good and the bad? How is a famous poem by Walt Whitman, another 19th century American poet, lived at the same time as Emily Dickinson. Walt Whitman's poetry tends to celebrate life, its mysteries, its magic, okay, its beauties. But there's a poem that he wrote entitled "The Rounded Catalogue Complete." And in that poem, and it's a relatively short poem, he addresses the 1920s, the majority of human experience of life that is not magical and beautiful, but that's degrading, or that's intolerable, that's painful, the suffering, the misery. You know, again, the kind of issues that religions tend to be primarily motivated to address. Okay? Well, and obviously we see that admixture, you know, of these divergent elements within individuals. Individuals capable of creating beauty, creating, you know, great works like art, but also capable of abuse, capable of intolerable behavior. In addressing this fundamental question of what to do, how to address the bad, because if life were everywhere joyous, if happiness, you know, was the fundamental experience and the fundamental reality, a lot of the questions that we have, you know, about the world, about the nature of life, wouldn't arise. The questions that inspire the religions, you know, wouldn't arise. Andre Malraux made a reference to the riddle of the world, and how he defined that was the supreme riddle of what am I doing on this earth where sorrow reigns? If we were not in the midst often of sorrow, of despair, of just the, you know, oppressiveness, you know, of circumstance, of frustration, we wouldn't have much of the world's religions. Turns out there are two fundamental approaches to dealing with the horror. One is, well, I'll sketch them. One is to establish some way that the good is so much greater, that no matter how despairing, no matter how much suffering there is, in the end, it's the beauty, it's the promise, it's the wonder that prevails overall. That tends to be so much greater, you know, in at least some type of relationship to the world, that all the horror and the ugliness kind of recedes. Doesn't disappear, but recedes. The other main approach is what the religions and what philosophy tends to offer, that what we see as horrific somehow is not, can be transformed in some way, can be reversed in some way. The relationship, the solution to the world that takes the form of embracing the good and not ignoring or losing the bad, not transforming it or transfiguring it, but just recognizing that in the balance, the good is much greater, sufficiently greater that life is worth living. The experience overall can be embraced. Is actually addressed, summarized in an essay, actually, that Matthew Arnold, a 19th century English poet and literary critic, wrote about the work of Shakespeare. And there are a couple of lines that address this issue in a distilled fashion, and I'll recite those here. Shakespeare, this is Matthew Arnold now, writing about Shakespeare's achievement. Shakespeare frequently has lines and phrases in a strain quite false, and which are entirely unworthy of him. Yet one can imagine him smiling if one could meet him in the Elysian fields and tell him so. Smiling and replying that he knew it perfectly well himself. And what did it matter? Because the glory, the greatness is so much superior that it overwhelms the inadequacies, the failings, the deficiencies. Okay? That's one approach. Right? And I actually presented that in the first few pages of the very first book I ever wrote in philosophy. The whole rest of my philosophical writing and philosophical development has gone in the other direction, the direction of trying to somehow redeem, transform, the ugly, the inadequate, the deficient, the horror. And as an illustration of how that works, there is an experience I had once with a rabbi, a prominent rabbi, actually, from a large temple in Los Angeles, a rabbi that I was introduced to by a student of mine who was interested in my philosophical work, but his parents were a little bit suspicious. They were Jewish, and they subscribed to the Jewish tradition, and they didn't know what my philosophical perspective quite represented in relation to their beliefs, what they valued. So I told the student of mine, well, who do they most admire? And he said, well, this particular rabbi. So I said, well, if you can arrange for me to talk to the rabbi, I can explain something about what I'm doing philosophically. So he'll understand, exactly, the nature, of my ideas. So that was arranged. And the actual meeting between me and the rabbi lasted about an hour and a half. And I was talking, outlining, and that's some years ago, so it would not have taken the same form. I would have said different things, used different kinds of examples, presented different philosophical results today than I did then. But I was stressing at that time that notion, past cannot guarantee future, future decides the past. I was also talking about issues that I've discussed, with you about how the philosophy can help basically annul pain, right? That pain exists in a conceptual framework of assumptions and presuppositions that the rigor of philosophy can help undermine, dislodge. So we were discussing that issue, the nature of suffering, the nature of pain. Turns out that within the Jewish tradition, there's a different view of pain, that it's ordained, or somehow God is ultimately responsible, and it's not something that philosophically one could have a switch for to just turn off. So this was not something that the rabbi apparently had heard before, but we discussed it congenially. He was receptive to the ideas. At some point, though, he asks me, what about the Holocaust? What about the suffering of the Holocaust? How does philosophy address that profundity of pain that depth of suffering. And I knew immediately what I wanted to say, but I was afraid that if I said it, I might be either escorted out of the office or thrown out of the office. Well, I decided to say what the philosophical response would be anyway. I said to the rabbi, the future decides if it ever occurred and has power to reverse it. Now notice, I wasn't denying the Holocaust. What I was saying is that no matter what the reality, even that of the Holocaust, the future has the power in principle even to reverse that reality. And if you don't think the future has that kind of power, you're not imagining the future taking a radically different direction from your expectation. Well, instead of throwing me out of the office, the rabbi is like silent. And he says to me, and this was quite extraordinary because I didn't know that this was part of the Jewish tradition, but apparently it is. He says to me, that is what the Messiah is supposed to say. Now, I'm not the Messiah, right? But it's fascinating to me that that view of the Messiah within the Jewish tradition is something that philosophy can get to just through the rigor of its analyses, of its processes. So that's an example of the power that religions seek to be able to transform events, reverse events, transform the bad into good, completely annul it. It's obviously profoundly transformational. It operates in philosophy at the level of the limit of rigor, right? That's the essence of philosophy. Within a theistic tradition, people, let's say, believing in God, embracing the concept of God, well, to say that the future can't reverse the past is to limit the power of God, to limit the power of the deity that you're believing in. And that is a presumption that we can't justify. So just to give you, so there we have it. So some examples of women that have been especially inspirational to me, and an example with Einstein and his first wife of how women might have played even a more decisive role than we imagine, than we often have given them credit for. Most importantly, though, is the recognition that whatever some of these historical realities might have been, women have that ability to contribute at the highest possible levels and to provide the most inspiring examples that human beings can ever conceive of. Okay, I see Aaliyah has joined us.
Thank you very much again for your talk, Stephen. We have got here 2 people giving you thumbs up and also people giving you nice comments. For example, finally, I would like to say thank you, Mr. Friedman, for this online conversation, which is considered by me as immersion into the philosophy world with a great person. I appreciate your contribution.
Thank you very much. I'm really appreciative of that. I really appreciate it. Thank you. It's my pleasure, to contribute, whatever ideas I may have on these issues. Oh, was there another comment?
Yeah, we have got just comments like, you got this, thank you. And we have 2 questions from people.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go on.
So the first one is, dear Mr. Friedman, what are your thoughts on baby's first language acquisition? second language as an adult, and how language forms our perspective of the world. Thank you.
Okay, this is central, to modern philosophy. Philosophy has been focused upon the issue of language for at least a century, and it is central to the work of the philosopher who's had the strongest influence upon me, which is Wittgenstein, the Austrian English philosopher, whose work, Philosophical Investigations, addresses this specific issue as penetratingly as it has ever been addressed in the history of the subject. It's one of the revolutionary things about Wittgenstein's philosophical efforts and contributions. The Philosophical Investigations begins with a quotation from St. Augustine. I mentioned how St. Augustine's Confessions were compared by John Berryman with Anne Frank's diary. Well, St. Augustine's Confessions contains a section where St. Augustine, details how he imagined he learned language. And the process that he describes is one where a person will point to an object and say the word for that object, chair, table, and the child will repeat that word and learn that association, and they learn language in that type of manner. Well, Wittgenstein pointed out that early on, the pointing gesture isn't even understandable. When somebody points to a chair, it's not clear before we know a lot of language. It's not clear whether the person is pointing to a shape, a color, what an object might be. The possibilities are almost endless. It's that type of pointing is called ostensive definition, where instead of giving words to define an object, a chair is a physical object that we can sit on and that will support us. It's a matter of actually identifying that, pointing to that particular thing. That pointing gesture works once we've already acquired a significant amount of the language, so that we can sort of make distinctions between the different possibilities of what that person might be pointing towards. The early acquisition of language is not a matter of explanation, it's a matter of training. And it's a matter of training in not just a label for an object, it's training and introduction into a whole form of life. That the meaning of a word, that, as Wittgenstein is really the first to emphasize, is not the object for which the word stands, which is what we normally imagine it to be, but the meaning of a word is the use that that word has within the language, within the culture. Ultimately, language is an instrument not of communication, but of coordination, social coordination. If there were no language, we wouldn't have ideas to communicate. Ideas exist within language, and language exists ultimately, primarily, for us to achieve social coordination, social enterprises that facilitate our survival. We are as social as any organism that we know of, and that social nature is facilitated primarily by language, by our ability, again, to coordinate our actions and our efforts. The second language that we learn, can be learned through labeling, because by the time we've already acquired one language, we understand the nature of human culture. We understand the nature of objects so that, we can go around, if we're learning French or learning Russian, and attach a label to chair, table, closet, wall, door, that identifies what that object is in the new language, the language we're trying to acquire. In fact, that's often how we do go about the process of learning, mastering a second language. And we like to, we'll go around and label everything in our environment. So we're constantly being exposed to the new word. But the original acquisition of the mother language, the first language, is a matter of a whole process of training and orientation to a way of life. It's because of that Wittgenstein, it's like late in the philosophical investigations, in a later stage of his writing, makes the comment: if a lion could talk, we could not understand it, because we are not part of the whole sort of way of life, of the lion. It's not a matter of, we tend to imagine the world as if we were outside the world, as if everything in our experience exists independently of our experience when we're not experiencing it. And so we imagine that, the tables, the chairs, are part of this objective world, this external reality that every life form would have to recognize. Not so. And again, all of Wittgenstein's mature philosophy basically is focused upon the implications of meaning, not the meaning of a word not being the word, the object for which the word stands, but the use of that word. And I think some lectures ago I gave an example of a primitive language where the only thing that the society is doing is building structures, and they're building structures out of bricks and stones. And there's a quarry where the bricks and the stones are being gathered and prepared, and there's a site where the building is taking place, the assembly is taking place. And we can imagine the entire communication, the entire form of life of that culture as one in which a person a builder, the person at the building site, holds up a sign or says the word brick, and in response to that, a person at the quarry, the site where the stones are being prepared and mined, brings a brick or brings a stone. That the meaning of the word brick or the meaning of the word stone in that culture, in that more primitive distilled culture, is: I show you the sign, I say the word, you bring me the object. But it's a matter of an action. So Wittgenstein also wrote in this regard, words are deeds. It's a matter of language facilitating a form of life. And what is central to that form of life is social integration and coordination. So again, language also is clustering things together based upon similarities, family resemblances. Any two chairs are not rigorously the same, they're approximately the same. So a linguistic space is a space of approximation. An epistemic space is a space of absolute rigor, where any two things are rigorously distinct, and ultimately, within that space, language doesn't exist. Oh, you know what I didn't do? I said I was going to read, a book, right, to conclude. Let me do that right now. It's not very long. There's another question, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Should we? What should we?
We can for the next session, I think.
Yeah, let's do that question for the next session because we didn't have any questions left over from this. So to conclude, let me read this book. Again, the book is called In the Throes of Close, The Call of the Rose. And one thing about it, it's not talking about fashion. The reason for the title is in the 18th century, early 19th century, an English writer and philosopher, Thomas Carlyle, when the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, great German philosopher of the 18th century, was first published, it was very difficult. People had trouble understanding it. So Thomas Carlyle wrote a sort of a popular treatment of Kantian philosophy. It's called Sartor Resartus, famous work in the history of not philosophy so much, but commentary on philosophy and the effort to make philosophy available to a broader public. And in that work, he uses to explain Kantian philosophy the metaphor of clothing. So this work was kind of inspired by that previous example. For me, I stress that concepts are like clothing, where they fit us approximately, whereas the ultimate nature of a rigorous reality is more like skin, where only one person can occupy, that skin. So it's on my phone. Let me get this. Now, again, don't worry so much. When I read these, it's almost like hearing a song where you might not understand all the lyrics, where the lyrics might not make total sense, but you'll hear some of the words and they'll create a mood. I mean, obviously based upon our talks, all the words that I'm using are things that I've discussed, words like heuristic and epistemic, but I read this more for the sound, okay? So let me pull this up. Okay, so it's in the throes of close, the call of the rose. And it actually has also at the very end a kind of a postscript, so which is a little bit off the philosophy, but I'll read that too. God paradigms self-sufficiency, enough to retort mortality. Possibilities to mortalities stake beaches to nondescript seas. We die a dyadic lie, haloed to an instrumental sky. Our notions are worn to the throes of close, or so our demons suppose, as if our divinities chose to cede the call of the rose. And so, don't hold your breath. There is of your world no death. Indignity to ventriloquy. Only other worlds can cease. At their will, to their caprice, in rigor partitioning peace, to the limit of our release. And then the afterword. His poet will one day disclose how he faithfully followed the call of the rose to all the lands his angels chose. And even as his destiny slowed, he continued to sing of the shining red rose. So that's the work. In the throes of close, the call of the rose. Okay. So I hope this was an enjoyable experience. I hope this was an enriching session. We have one question that I will address next time. I'll probably read the question at the very beginning, but not answer it until I've completed my talk, which I don't yet have the topic for, just so you know, but I will over this weekend.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for such an amazing talk. We have got many comments. I thank you wholeheartedly. And then
Thank
say,
you.
I would love to hear more of your poetry.
I can do that.
And
Yes.
from the questions, we are going to leave this question for the next session. I'm going to read it out again. Recently, Larry King died. He was the best interviewer in my eyes. About 2 years ago, he was asked by to Neil deGrasse Tyson. The question was, if you could live forever, would you? So, what would you answer? So, we're going to keep this question for the next session.
Excellent question. Yes, I
Amazing
will
question.
address
Thank
it.
you very much, Ansar, for asking your question. And also, one more comment. Have a wonderful weekend from Ekaterina. Thank you very much for your comment, Ekaterina. So, let me quickly copy the questions for the next session. And one more time, thank you all for joining us today. We have had an amazing topic, and we're waiting for even more amazing topics upcoming the next week. And see you all next week again. Thank you very much, the U.S. General Consulate in Almaty, and also American Space Almaty. And thank you very much, Stephen, for such an amazing talk. And thank you all for joining us. We will be very glad to see you all. Stay active, prepare your questions, and stay safe.
Thank you very much. And I hope to see you all next week. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you all.